Hello, BookTube. We're in our second week of our Homer along, our read-along of Homer's Iliad, books 6 through 12 this time around, in which the pitched battle between the Trojans and the Greeks distinctly starts to favor the Trojans. At the beginning of this installment, Zeus, the king of the gods on Olympus, warns the other gods not to get involved in the fighting anymore. He's withdrawn them and he wants them to stay out of it. And he himself stays out of it, and almost right away when he does that, the tide starts to turn in their favor. First, there's a duel between Hector, the greatest warrior of the Trojans, and Ajax, one of the strongest warriors of the Greeks, in which the duel itself is a little inconclusive. It's called off before either one can die, but we do get a little hair-shivering presentiment of Hector's end, because he's wounded by Ajax, and he's not just wounded anywhere, he's wounded in the neck. And as you can see from this Hans Endry picture on the cover of the Robert Fitzgerald translation, a wound in the throat for Hector is going to become very, very much of an omen. But after that, when the Trojans withdraw and the two sides bury their dead and whatnot, after that, when pitched warfare resumes, things go mostly for the Trojans. Almost every one of the prominent Greek kings or captains is wounded, and Hector seems to sweep everything before him. There are some fantastic, protracted battle scenes, but it ends, every one of those installments ends with the Greeks giving ground. Until finally, at one point, their nightmare scenario has come true. They have pulled all the way back to their ships, and the Trojans are encamped on the field. They're not behind the walls of Troy, the famous God-built walls of Troy. They're encamped in their thousands out on the plain. That's how in control they are. I've got a bit of it here that I want to read to you. That's Homer at his finest. Just because, as people have said before me, even offhandedly, he brings the whole world into everything he does. It's incredible. You have to pause to realize it, because it's such a headlong poem that if you don't, you'll miss it. But this is the moment. So all night long, buoyed up with hopes, they sat along the lines of battle, and many fires burned. As the stars in the sky stand out in all their splendor round the bright moon, when the upper air is still, when every lookout place, headland, mountain, ravine stands out, and infinite upper airs flood down from the skies, when every star is visible, and the shepherd rejoices in his heart. So many were the fires lit by the Trojans that could be seen in front of Ilium between the streams of Scamander and the Greek ships. There were 1,000 fires burning on the plain, and round each one sat 50 men in the light of its blaze, while horses stood beside their chariots munching white barley and rye, and awaiting dawn on her golden throne. And when that dawn comes, things keep getting worse for the Greeks, until finally, led by Glaucus and led by Sarpedon and led by Hector, the Trojans actually breach the Greek battlements and start to attack the ships themselves. We end this little segment of what we're reading with the Greeks in full rout. And yet, despite all that violence, there's a huge amount of pitched violence in this segment, as in almost every segment. Despite that, there are some wonderful, quintessentially Homeric moments that I wanted to underscore. I'm sure you've noticed them yourself. At the very beginning, we get one inside the walls of Troy, in Troy town itself, where Hector meets his wife. In a stolen moment from all of the chaos and the confusion and the fighting, he meets his wife, who's carrying his little baby son. And his wife asks how things are going, and Hector, in the poem as we have it now, flat out tells her. He doesn't encourage her or buck her up. He tells her what he sees her future will be. Broken, enslaved, worse than dead, wishing she were dead, totally beaten. It's not the sort of thing. It's not a human moment. It's not the sort of thing that a husband would say to his wife, but it's a remarkably accurate prophecy of what a highborn woman in a captured, besieged town can expect if her town loses. And we know that even worse is in store for Astaniax, the little boy. And Homer's audience would have known it too. But in place of Hector turning from his wife and giving an equally harrowing prophecy to his little baby, instead Homer gives us a beautiful moment, a beautifully human moment, where the baby is frightened by Hector's enormous horsehair plume. It's a neat little moment, and it's followed not long after by another moment in the middle of pitched battle, when the Greek champion Diomedes is looking for Trojans to kill and encounters one that he professes not to know, and asks him, "Who are you? Or if you're a god, I won't fight with you," which is kind of ironic because Diomedes fights with plenty of gods in the course of the poem, but wants to know his history. And it's Glaucus who tells him his history. They swap mythology, they swap tales, and once they've done that, Diomedes realizes, well, our families go back a long way. We share bonds of kinship. I'm not going to fight you. There are plenty of other Trojans for me to fight. And not only that, but there in the midst of battle with people fighting and dying all around them, they grasp hands in friendship and they decide to swap armor. It's, the ultimate warrior sign of fidelity. And it's an odd and very effective moment of breathtaking in the midst of all of this chaos. And it's also, I'll cite an ex-cathedra opinion here. It's also one of the half dozen or so places in the course of the Iliad that I think reveals something for which certainly the scholarly census is against me, but I think that moment reveals that one of or some of the people who were involved in writing down the Iliad were very much not the people who originally composed it or, conceived it. That moment between Diomedes and Glaucus is a wonderful moment of brotherhood in the midst of war, and the things that they say about each other, that our families go back a long way, that if you go back a generation or two, they're deeply connected with bonds of friendship and hospitality. That could be said about almost any Trojan and almost any Greek. That moment is wonderful, and it is a reflection on the humanity of war. And then it's ruined. In the Iliad, as we have it now, the last bit of that exchange is the narrator breaking in and saying that the gods must have clouded Glaucus's thinking because his armor was so much less valuable than Diomedes. He hands him, they swap armor, and Glaucus is suddenly poorer because he's given better armor to his friend. And that, I think, was a sniggering editorial comment put onto an original scene by someone with completely different sensibilities than the person who conceived the original scene. But I could be wrong about that, but I see that, I know that kind of a brass wrong note about half a dozen times in the Iliad, and about half a dozen times in the Odyssey as well. And you have to keep in mind, Homeric scholars love to assert certainty, but we know virtually nothing of how this was actually transmitted to us in written form. We know virtually nothing of how that happened. It could easily be that somebody was, I don't even know, writing it out for school exercise or something, decided to make a joke or put in a sour comment. One way or another. With the favor of the gods withdrawn, the Trojans start to win. They encamp on the fields, they attack the battlements. At one point, Sarpedon pulls down part of the Greek wall, part of the Greek rampart. And it's tough to miss the implication in the course of the books that we're reading here that the Greeks kind of sort of deserve it. That part of the reason why they're losing isn't just because the Trojans are really strong, are fierce people, and also defending their own home, but also because the Greeks aren't worthy. And we see that in a couple of different ways. There's an embassy that is sent to Achilles, who has withdrawn from the fighting because High King Agamemnon took his slave girl. And so in a high fit of dudgeon, he pouts with his ships and his men outside of the fighting. Imagine how the fighting would be different if Achilles and the Myrmidons had been involved in it, but no. They're all encamped in their ships. And finally, wiser heads prevail on Agamemnon to send an embassy to Achilles, composed of not only, I'm not going to say Ulysses, Odysseus. Composed not only of Odysseus, who's the finest speaker in the Greek camp, but also Phoenix, the man who raised Achilles in boyhood. He sends an embassy with extravagantly generous offers to Achilles if he will agree to return to the fighting. And when the embassy first gets there, and Odysseus starts to speak, Achilles says, "You shouldn't waste your breath. I will feast you, I will be a good host, but I'm leaving. I'm not just going to pout with my ships, I'm taking my men and sailing away." And then Phoenix speaks up and tells him all about their shared history, and I helped to raise you, and I was hoping for better and whatnot. And Achilles grudgingly says, well, okay, maybe I won't sail away. And it doesn't do any good. That's as far as he'll go. He comes one humiliating step by step down from his original fit of pique, but he doesn't agree to return to the fighting, despite the fact that the sufferings of the rest of the army are obvious to him by this point. He still doesn't agree, and the embassy leaves. And when they get back to the main body of the army, Diomedes says, well, it was never going to succeed. We just have to do without him. That kind of fatalism, that kind of knowledge, not just on his part, but on a lot of people's parts, that Achilles is just a lost cause. It takes the towering rage, the wrath that we first opened the poem with, and makes it look very petty. And it's not just Achilles, because this segment of the poem that we're reading now also has the infamous night raid scene, where the Greeks decide to send a small group of people on a night raid of the Trojan forces. Almost never done in ancient warfare. Not just because it was extra perilous, but because it was seen as dishonorable. And they capture a Trojan, and they extract a lot of tactical information from him, and he begs them, well, okay, now that I've told you what you want to know, leave me bound here on the field, take me back to your ships as a captive, and I'm sure that I'll be ransomed one way or the other. And instead, after he's given them what they want, they kill him. Again, totally unworthy, a totally dishonorable thing to do. And those aren't the only, the whining and complaining of the Greek captains as they are one by one taken out of battle is also, you start to notice it all of a piece. These 6 books do a lot to challenge our stereotypical understanding that the Greeks are the good guys. It certainly destroys the idea that although he's the main character, it destroys the idea that Achilles is the hero here. He's not. Despite the fact that there are all sorts of classical paradigms of epic poetry that say, well, he is. He isn't. Clearly he isn't. He's not admirable in any way. He's not emulatable in any way. He just happens to be the focal character of this version of these events transmitted in this way, and that's all. And that brings us to the end of these books. At the end of these books, Troy is triumphant. The Greeks are pushed all the way back and desperate and routed. And you know that's going to change. But at the end of these 6 books, I'm wondering now about your own reading, especially those of you who are reading this closely for the first time. Did those moments change things for you? Do you feel? I think that these books really show what Homer can do. To put it crudely, they really show. There are other ancient epics that you can read, and even in the best translation, you realize right away, oh, okay, well, this is a work of art that may have spoken directly to a time and a culture and a sensibility, but it's long gone. I can maybe, with some professor's help, figure out how it spoke to that culture, but it doesn't in any way speak to my culture. There are plenty of epics that are like that, plenty of them. I would argue that one of the main ones is Virgil's Aeneid. But that's absolutely not true for Homer. And I think that's why he's been revered so ecstatically for so long, because you get moments like the ones in these 6 books. You get a massive dramatic surge back and forth like the ones in these books that speak directly to human drama, not the drama of any one culture. That's what I think, and I want to know what you think. When you were reading these, did these 6 books, those of you who are reading along at home, did these 6 books make you like reading the Iliad more than you had already liked it at the end of the first 6 books? Did this increase your desire to keep going? And keep going we shall. So we'll take this up next week, when I assure you things will change dramatically. And I'll see you then. Thank you, BookTube.